Hello, I am Sam Smith, and this is Sam's MCAT Basics. This podcast covers the most important topics put out on the AAMC MCAT each year, and I determined this list by going through all the official practice materials that the AAMC puts out, and also some third-party practice material, and just put together this big list of topics that consistently kept on showing up, and ranked those topics and made podcasts out of it. This podcast will cover social theories. This is going to include things like conflict theory, social constructionism, symbolic interaction, etc. And then I'm going to talk about psychological theories behind emotion. And then I'll also talk about motivational theories. What is it that motivates people? What are the theories there? Such stuff like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in this podcast, I'm hoping to give a lot of different examples, relate a lot of these concepts to medicine, and then hopefully also tell some kind of entertaining stories. This topic will show up on one out of the 4 MCAT sections. That is the psych-soc section. And hopefully this podcast will help you. It's going to be a lot of terminology, a lot of stuff to memorize. I hope it helps. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about here are social theories. So what is a social theory, and what is a social theory used to do? Well, a social theory essentially takes a look at societies through some kind of lens. So, imagine that you're on the top of the Empire State Building, and if you've been there, you know that all around the outside rim of where you look off into all the buildings in New York, there's these telescopes that you can look through. And, they're like big binoculars that are on these big platforms. So imagine social theory is kind of in the same sense there, right? You're on the top of the Empire State Building, you're looking down at society, and you can look through all these different sets of lenses. Imagine each of these lenses is a different social theory. So this just gives you a different kind of view of society, a different way at looking at society. And so there are a few different social theories that I'm going to present here. We have functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, social constructionism, rational choice exchange theory. And then after these kind of main social theories, I'm going to present a few smaller, less important ones, but still might come up in the MCAT. And these are feminism theory, behaviorism, the life course theory, and then also medicalization. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into these theories. So the first one I want to talk about here is functionalism. Functionalism was established by Emile Durkheim, and according to functionalism, society is a system of interconnected parts that work together in harmony in order to maintain a state of balance and a societal equilibrium for the whole of society. So this kind of looks at society from a macro perspective, right? They're looking at the whole society, not just individuals interacting. And this will be important for distinguishing this from different theories that I talk about later. But just understand for now, this takes a big picture look at society. And another way you can think about this is it essentially says that society works like the human body, right? You have all these different organs working together to keep your body at homeostasis. You have your kidneys filtering and excreting toxic stuff in your blood, but at the same time, you have insulin being released in the body by the pancreas, and then that's regulating glucose within your blood. So it's all kind of working together to keep your body stable and at equilibrium. Well, in the same way, the functionalist perspective takes a look at society and these different parts that kind of work together in order to maintain that society. So for example, how would a functionalist look at schools and the nuclear family? Well, they might say that these both work together in order to socialize children, right? You send your kid to school, they're able to socialize with other children, learn how to be cool or, not be cool depending on the situation. And then the parents also play a role, right, in socialization and raising that kid to be a good kid. So a functionalist might say, okay, well, these are working together to raise children. And it's important to note that functionalists use 2 terms to describe the effects of social elements. They use the term function to describe elements of society that contribute to social stability, whereas dysfunctions are used to describe elements of society that actually disrupt social stability. So, what's an example of a dysfunction? You can think of that as something like crime, right? Crime causes harm within society, people getting robbed, murdered. It's all bad for society, right? No one's going to argue that people getting murdered is a good thing for society. So that's a dysfunction. However, some actually would argue that crime in itself serves somewhat of a functional role. Some people will say that this increases people's awareness of those around them, crime does, and that it actually increases social cohesiveness, right? Because if there's crime going around in society, that makes people kind of rely on each other for help. You got to rely on your neighbors for help. You might tell your neighbor, hey, watch my house while I'm out of town on vacation, whatever. But that kind of creates social cohesion if there's crime around you. That's one theory. So anyways, I just showed you how an element of society can be dysfunctional, and I showed you how an element of society can be functional. So remember those terms. And so functionalism also says that these functions or these good parts of society can either be latent or they can be manifest. And so a manifest function is an action that is intended to have a positive influence on society. Meanwhile, a latent function is an action that produces an unintended positive influence on society. Keyword there, unintended. So, for example, let's take football. And of course, here I'm talking about American football because that's a real kind of football. And, let's think about manifest functions and latent functions in terms of football's effect on society. So football provides value to society by entertaining people and bringing them together. And I would say that this is intended, right? When football was developed, it was developed in order to create a game for people to watch to be entertained. So let's just say its manifest function is to entertain people and bring them together. Okay, cool. Well, what's its latent function? Well, you could say that, maybe its latent function is to help improve brain science in the long run. And why is this? Well, because of football, we're a little more interested in CTE and aging of the brain after, continuous hits being taken in the head. Maybe this is going to help us understand the brain in ways that we didn't before. So you could say this is an unintended improvement to society that is provided by football. And obviously, this part's made up. Maybe this isn't actually providing any new brain research or anything like that. But anyways, you can see here how football can have a manifest function in American society and also a latent or unintended good influence on society. So how can functionalism be applied to medicine? Well, through the lens of functionalism, medicine serves to maintain equilibrium in society, right? It provides care for people and it improves their lives, which these both help maintain the societal equilibrium. And so in terms of manifest functions, medicine helps in the assessment of health status, separation of the ill from the well, the care of the ill, curing illnesses, and also, disease prevention. These are all good manifest functions. They're intended and they're good functions. Well, what about the latent functions? Well, according to a 1975 article written by Alfred Childs, who is a medical doctor who published a paper in the Public Health Reports, he says that there are a few, 3 in specific, latent functions of medicine. The first is that medical care offsets the impersonality of mass society by giving people a chance to talk intimately with health personnel about what matters to them and what troubles them. He also says another latent function of medicine is that it introduces some degree of rationality into everyday life. The healthcare system can often confront people with facts in which they must respond in terms of a personal choice, right? So if you're diagnosed with cancer, then you are forced to respond to that, accept it, and move forward. And it introduces a degree of rationality. The last latent function that this doctor suggests is that it preserves an efficient labor force. Just think about how many people are employed by the medical field, right? You have nurses, doctors, techs, consultants. There's just so many people. And hopefully you and I will be part of this labor force one day. So the next theory I want to introduce is called conflict theory. And conflict theory was developed by Karl Marx, and it focuses on how power differentials contribute to the maintenance of social order. And it also looks at how different groups of people use power to exert dominance over others. And so this can be dominance over others in terms of economic, social, political resources, etc. A lot of different things. And the origins of this conflict perspective can be traced back to the classical works of Karl Marx, as I mentioned. And Marx essentially suggested that all societies go through different stages of economic development. And as these societies evolve from agricultural to industrial, the concern over meeting survival needs is actually replaced by concern over making a profit. And this, he suggested, is the hallmark of a capitalist system. And he went on to say that this leads to the development of two classes of people: the bourgeoisie, or the owners of the means of production. You can think about these as the heads of the factories, business owners, etc. And the other class was the proletariat. And these were kind of, the less powerful factory workers or farm workers that didn't have as much power as the bourgeoisie. So then Karl Marx went on to found the conflict theory as he saw conflict between this bourgeoisie class and the proletariat. So again, the conflict theory looks at the power differentials and how they maintain societal order. So let's take this perspective and again apply it to the NFL, which is the National Football League. And so how can we look through the lens of conflict theory and look at the NFL? Well, you can look and say, okay, who holds a lot of the power within the NFL? And that is going to be the team owners, right? The team owners, the NFL executives, they own a lot of this power. And who owns not a lot of the power? Well, that's the players. This can create a power dynamic that's not great, right? These players are the ones putting their bodies out there, getting hit, some of them developing arthritic joints at early ages. They're putting their bodies on the line, while these owners, these powerful guys, are just sitting there up at the top, sipping on a beer or whatever. So this power differential can be explored, and that is done through the lens of conflict theory. What about in terms of the healthcare system? So the conflict theory can look at the healthcare system and say that access to healthcare is actually worse for lower class individuals. The less money you have, the worse your healthcare is going to be, and this creates kind of a gradient of healthcare among individuals from different socioeconomic classes. The next social theory I want to talk about is called Symbolic Interactionism. This was developed by George Herbert Mead. And essentially, symbolic interactionism studies the ways that individuals interact with each other through shared understanding of words, gestures, and other symbols. And this is a small-scale theory, right? So this is a micro theory. This looks at interactions between individuals. It doesn't take a big, outstanding look at society like conflict theory and like functionalism. This kind of zooms in and is looking at individual interactions. And so one thing I want to talk about here is that symbolic interactionism really hinges on symbols. So what are symbols? So symbols are just objects or things that we attach some kind of meaning to. Think about, for example, when you're driving and you might by accident just cut somebody off, right? You might not have been paying as much attention as you should have to the road. You change lanes on the highway, you accidentally cut somebody off. Well, sometimes what they're going to do is they're going to give you the finger, right? And they might yell a 4-letter F word, whatever. But we attach meaning to that gesture. We attach meaning to that middle finger, and we know what that means, right? That's probably pisses you off a little bit. When I see it, I kind of laugh, or I'm like, come on, man, like who cares? But nonetheless, that is a symbol that society puts meaning on, right? And that symbol actually influences our interactions with one another, right? If you just walked up to someone on the street and gave them a middle finger, odds are you probably not going to have a good interaction. So yeah, that is an example of a symbol. And so how can medicine be looked at through the lens of symbolic interactionism? Well, when patients and doctors interact, a lot of times the doctor is dressed in a very specific manner, right? The physician is going to have a lab coat. A lot of times they're dressed very nice. They have a stethoscope. And why is that important? Well, these symbols actually determine how these interactions go, or they really influence interactions, right? When you're a patient and you're going to see a physician, you're expecting to see that physician dressed the way they are. And this actually helps give you confidence in terms of being able to trust your physician. Essentially, the stethoscope and the tie or the nice dress and the lab coat, all that goes together to say, I am a doctor, you can trust me, right? That's what those symbols say in terms of interactions. Closely related to the idea of symbolic interactionism is the idea of social constructionism. Social constructionism emphasizes the idea that society is actively and creatively produced by human beings. So essentially, a social construct arises from humans working together to agree on the significance of some idea or object. And again, this sounds kind of like symbolic interactionism. You might be saying like, wait, isn't that the same thing? It's not, because this gets more at why ideas arise, not necessarily how they affect our interactions. So when you think of social constructionism, think about why ideas arise. Again, let's take the example of football. A social constructionist is likely to look at the rules of football and say, okay, these are socially constructed rules. Now, why is that? Well, obviously, the players, the refs, the coaches, everybody who's involved in a football team has to actually come to an understanding and come to agree on these set of rules. But these rules are by no means intrinsic, right? You're not born coming out of the womb, saying holding is a 5-yard penalty. It's not like that. These are not some kind of intrinsic rules. These are something that are socially constructed. So how can we look at medicine through the social constructionism lens? Well, what we can do is we can say that, society creates these stereotypes. And let me just preface this by saying that some stereotypes are actually useful in diagnosing patients. So take, for example, a child versus an elderly patient. Let's say that they are both expressing signs of heart disease. Well, in the child, you're much less likely to say, okay, maybe this child has heart disease, and then start digging into that, finding biomarkers, finding evidence of them having heart disease, than for an elderly patient. And so you discriminate between those two. You say, okay, this child probably less likely to have heart disease, and you start looking at other diseases you can diagnose them with. And in terms of the elderly patient, you're probably more likely to say, all right, this patient might have heart disease. Let's really take a deep dive and look and see if we can diagnose this patient. So that's important to remember, is that not all stereotypes are necessarily bad. All right, so going back to my original point here, and that is that using this social constructionism, sometimes we can use these socially constructed stereotypes that cause harm actually in patient care. And so, take for example, a doctor concluding that men tolerate pain better than women, or women tolerate pain better than men. Well, then this doctor is, maybe without even realizing that they're doing it, going to say, please rate your pain for me. And when the patient says 9, then maybe in the back of their mind, they're thinking, okay, this is a dude, and so he must really be experiencing a lot of pain. Or, this is a girl, so she really must be experiencing a lot of pain. Or, maybe a woman comes in and says, I'm experiencing a 9, and the doctor's like, well, she's a girl, she might be a wuss. And so you can see that sometimes these socially constructed stereotypes can actually cause harm in patient care, causing doctors to treat patients a little bit differently, and therefore cause patients to receive unequal care. And so when we use these socially created stereotypes in order to treat patients differently, that can be an example of how you can use the social constructionist lens to look at medicine and say, okay, this is something that we want to change. The next sociological theory is called rational choice exchange theory. And this theory is another one of those micro scale theories where it kind of takes a deeper dive and looks at interactions between individuals in a society. And what rational choice exchange theory does is it assumes that people make rational choices based on evaluating the rewards and punishments of interactions. And so what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to break down this theory a little bit more into two components. That is the rational choice component and the exchange component. Rational choice theory is a way of looking at deliberations between a number of potential courses of action and then using some kind of rationality in one form or another, one sense or another, to then decide which course of action is best for yourself. Or, this can be done by a corporation, deciding what's best for that corporation. And another way to say this is that people act in ways that are best for them, right? You make a decision on some rationale and decide what's best for you. So that's rational choice theory. Now, social exchange theory is just an application of rational choice theory. Social exchange theory essentially looks at interactions between individuals as some sort of a cost-benefit analysis, right? It says that, am I more likely to interact with you or do something for you if I see that you are going to reciprocate? So, for example, say my friend calls me and says, hey, Sam, I need you to help me move my couch. Am I likely to do that? Well, what the social exchange theory posits is that you are more likely to do that favor for your friend if you see some reciprocation from them, or if you think that's going to happen, right? You weigh the costs, say, okay, I'm going to be moving this couch, is going to take up my time. Then you look at the benefits. Well, maybe they'll be more apt to help me in the future. They're going to buy me beer, whatever it is. You weigh these costs and benefits, and then you go forward with that interaction. Dating and relationships is another piece or part of society that you can apply the social exchange theory to, right? So in general, relationships are give and take. There's benefits, there's fun, there's companionship, there's support, and then there's stuff that's bad, right? You tie it down, you can't talk to as many girls anymore, or boys, whatever, it doesn't matter. And what happens, or what social exchange theory says happens, is that we take all these factors, we weigh them out, and we say, okay, I want to date this person because the benefits outweigh the bad. And, one way I kind of remember this rational choice exchange theory is I kind of think of it as almost like a selfish theory. Like, it's all focused on the individual. This really only takes into account what that individual making the decision thinks, right? It doesn't really take into account the effect on the other person. So I think of this as more of the selfish theory. And so one way the rational choice exchange theory can be applied to medicine is in terms of motivating patients to adhere to their treatment or, the medication that has been prescribed, or to even follow up. So, if you think about these patients as individual actors who take into account all the benefits and all the risks of not going through with some treatment, then you can think, okay, well, how can I motivate this patient to, adhere to their treatment? And essentially what it says is that the benefits of this treatment must outweigh the risks in order for the patient to go through and complete the treatment. And so one interesting case of this is the dose of a medicine, right? And so a lot of these drug companies know that if a patient is going to have to take a drug 4 or 5 times a day, then it's not going to happen, right? It is a net negative for a patient to take a medicine, 5 times a day. So a lot of these drug companies actually formulate their medicines to be taken once daily or twice daily. And twice daily is pretty much the maximum, at least that I've seen, in terms of number of times a day to take a medicine. And that's because after twice a day doses, you start to fall off in terms of adherence to that medication. And so, looking at that through the rational choice exchange lens, you'd say, okay, that makes sense because the annoyance of this treatment actually outweigh the benefits. So this is just one instance of this principle or of this lens applied to medicine. All right, now I want to get into a little bit lower yield, less important theories, but still ones that are bound to come up at least once or twice on some of the practice tests you'll take and hopefully on the MCAT that you take. The first one I want to talk about here is a theory that falls under the umbrella of conflict theory, and that is the feminist theory. And so what the feminist theory or feminist lens does is it aims to understand gender and inequality. And so what it does is it looks at how men or women hold power over other women. It addresses the roles women have in society and the ongoing battles in which they face. And typically they focus on the rights of women, and this can include economic rights, sexual, reproductive rights, property rights, and voting rights. And so how can the feminist lens be applied to medicine? Well, historically, women are underrepresented in clinical trials. A 2016 paper by Catherine Liu and Natalie Mager in the journal called Pharmacy Practice kind of discusses this. And so what they say is not until 1993 did Congress mandate the adequate inclusion of women in NIH-sponsored clinical trials. And you need to do this in order to determine the difference in drug properties between men and women, right? This paper goes on to talk about how there are pharmacodynamic differences between the sexes that have been observed for particular drugs. For example, women are at an increased risk of experiencing certain fatal heart arrhythmias after taking certain drugs that in men don't produce that effect. In addition, acute liver failure as a result of certain drug exposures has been reported in women more often than men. So if you apply the feminist theory here, you say, okay, women should really be included in these clinical trials so that we can understand how these drugs affect women differently than men. And oddly enough, this is no bullshit. I was just scrolling through my Instagram feed, and I saw an ad for, I think it was Infinity Cars or whatever, and it was saying that women are at a higher likelihood of dying in car accidents because these crash test dummies are actually modeled from men's bodies, which is kind of interesting. I don't know. And is that a coincidence that just popped up on my phone like minutes before I was talking about it on this podcast? Highly unlikely, And if that's not evidence that there's a God that exists, then I don't know what is. Anyways, back to the issue at hand. So the next sociological theory I want to talk about here is called behaviorism. And behaviorism is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. If you don't know anything about conditioning, or you maybe haven't thought about it in a while, go listen to my learning podcast, and I give a pretty detailed explanation of what conditioning is. I go into operant conditioning, I go into classical conditioning. What you're going to want to know here is operant conditioning, though. And if you remember, I'll give you a brief interlude here. Operant conditioning is when you have reinforcers and you have punishers, right? And so when you give a reinforcement, you want this behavior to continue. When you give a punishment, you want that behavior to stop. So the behaviorism theory essentially says that throughout our interactions, we get these positive reinforcements or these punishments that kind of modulate our behavior or determine what our behavior is. In other words, this theory says that we act the way we do because we've been conditioned to do so. So here's an example. So let's just imagine that you're on some European phase or whatever, and so you quit shaving your armpits and you start smoking cigarettes and stuff. And what you've started doing is you've actually started kissing people on the lips when you first meet them. I think that's something European people do. Anyways, you've been doing this. And what happens is you get feedback behavior from people, right? So, you go up to a stranger, you say, hi, nice to meet you. Then you kiss them on the lips. And what they'll do is they'll look back at you. Maybe they have a really weird facial expression like, whoa, what the hell is that? Or maybe they say, please don't do that. That's weird. Well, you're more likely to quit this behavior because of those responses, right? You start to learn, okay, that's not okay for me to do. And so what the behaviorism theory would say is that these responses, these harsh words or facial expressions given to you are actually punishments, right? And that these punishments cause you to then change your behavior over time, and therefore you have been conditioned not to kiss people on the lips. And again, if you go back and look at operant conditioning, you'd realize that this is a positive punishment, right? Because somebody is adding something to decrease your behavior. And what was it they added? Well, that would be the words or facial expressions. And this is kind of a specific case. I get that. But what I'm trying to get at here is that behaviorism essentially says that, people behave a certain way because they have been conditioned to do so. And so how can we apply the behaviorism theory to medicine? Well, doctors tell patients to follow certain protocols to improve their health. Let's say this patient has high LDL levels and the doctor says, okay, you need to stay away from, X, Y, and Z foods. I'm going to give you this statin. They'll give them this whole protocol to follow in order to make sure that they have a reduced risk of developing heart disease or atherosclerosis. And, a primary care physician might, find out that this patient hasn't been adhering to the protocol that they developed for him. At this point, the physician would express disapproval and say, you need to do this in order to live longer, etc. And you can kind of think of this as a form of conditioning. However, though, this would be seen as some kind of positive reinforcer because you want to increase some behavior in the patient. All right, last two theories here. The first is life course theory. And this is actually a really applicable theory to medicine, right? And so what the life course theory looks at is it investigates a person's life history in terms of cultural, social, and structural contexts. For example, when I go into my family physician in like 20 years or whatever, I'll be talking to my family doc, at which point he'll understand that I was a millennial. And so what he's going to ask me is, in your 20s or teens, how often did you vape? Or, how many joules did you use? How many joule pods did you go through? And at this point, he or she may be trying to assess my risk level for some disease that, in the future we may know that, joules or vaping is bad. I'm not saying that it is, but let's just pretend that now we know it's bad. We don't know yet. And so anyways, what they're doing is they're looking back, looking at your history, looking at what generation you're from, and therefore kind of concluding different things about you based on your background. And then, they might look at societal factors, what is going on through your history. Was there some big social upheaval event? Was there a revolutionary war? Whatever. They're going to tie all these factors together and try to care for your health in this very wholesome, all-encompassing view. So again, the life course perspective is a whole look at a person's history in terms of many different social and cultural factors. And you will probably see that at some point on the MCAT. I think that's come up on quite a bit of the practice material. And the last theory to understand is called medicalization, which by the name, I'm sure is very applicable to medicine. And so medicalization is the process by which human conditions and problems come to be defined and treated as medical conditions, and thus become the subject of medical studies, diagnosis, preventment, and treatment. And so applying this to the medical field, you can look at mental illness. And so mental illness is seen as something that is becoming increasingly medicalized. And I want to preface this by saying this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. So, don't hate me if this is you and this pisses you off. But, I think the attitude lately has been, oh, you have anxiety, let's give you a pill or two and, that should fix you. And in reality, a lot of the root causes of anxiety are not addressed. So for instance, in a 2016 review, there were 12 different random controlled trials that suggested benefits of exercise for select groups in the treatment of anxiety. And so this review really showed that, the effects of exercise can be just as great in terms of helping cure anxiety as a lot of different medications are. Again, though, some people obviously need medical intervention, need pills, need different medications in order to get rid of their anxiety, and I get that. So again, medicalization can be defined as the process by which some aspects of human life come to be considered as medical problems, whereas before they were not considered a medical problem or they were not considered pathological. All right, so that concludes the discussion on sociological theories. We talked about functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, social constructionism, rational choice exchange theory, and then a few more, a little bit more briefly on the last ones, but all of them are still important. And I think the big key here is to be able to apply these. You know, what the MCAT is going to do is the MCAT is going to give you a passage, and you'll read the passage, and what they'll ask you to do is say, okay, how do we apply lens X to this, or how do we apply the conflict theory? And then they'll give you a bunch of answers, and you got to basically choose and say, okay, this is the best one for looking at this study or this passage in terms of that theory. So, go through these passages, practice applying them, make sure you really understand them in your head, both conceptually and pragmatically. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about here are the different theories of emotions. I want to address what causes emotions. Why do you get happy, sad, mad, depending on certain things that may happen, depending on these certain stimulus, depending on these certain physiological response. We'll go through these different theories of what causes emotions. And there's four main theories to know that I'm going to go over. There is the James-Lange theory, there is the Canon theory, there is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, and then there is the Lazarus theory. All right, so before I start, I just want you to put yourself into the situation that I'm going to use as an example for each of these emotional theories. So let's just say you've been at work all day, you've worked a 10-hour day, and you get off work and now you got to walk home. You walk home a mile, a long walk, you're tired, you're hangry, you're pissed off, whatever, and you get home, you open the door, and all of a sudden you hear the clanking of your dog's tags against their neck, and your dog runs up to you and, super happy to see you, and all of a sudden, all that weight from work is lifted off your shoulders, you're super happy, and you forget all about your long day at work. All right, so now that you're familiar with the situation that you're in, let's introduce these different theories. All right, so the James-Lange theory of emotion says that the experience of emotion is due to the perception of a physiological response. In other words, there is some event that occurs, and because of that, you get some physiological arousal, and then you interpret that arousal, and then that's what leads to emotion. So that's the James-Lange theory of emotion. And so how do we apply this to the situation that I just described? Well, the James-Lange theory says that when you see your dog, you have a physiological response. Let's just say that endorphins are released. And then what happens is your brain actually interprets that physiological response and says, okay, you're releasing endorphins, you must be happy. And from there, you have an emotion in which you are happy to see your dog after your long day at work. And what's important to note here is that James and Lange both theorized that the emotions came directly because of the physiological response. The next theory is called the Canon theory of emotion. And so this states that the physiological response and emotional response towards a stimulus occur simultaneously. In other words, you have some stimulus, and then you have an emotional response and a physiological response at the same time. So applying this to our dog situation again, what happens is that you see your dog as you walk in the door, and then simultaneously you start to release endorphins and experience emotion. Next, the Schachter-Singer theory states that emotion is based on two factors, and that is the physiological arousal and the cognitive label assigned to that situation or stimulus. And so essentially what this says is that you have a physiological response, and then you use your current cognition in order to assign meaning. In other words, we don't feel emotion until we are able to identify the situation that we're in. And this is what sets it apart from the James-Lange theory, because they do sound kind of similar. So in other words, for the Schachter-Singer theory, you must interpret the situation before you feel an emotion. For the James-Lange theory, the emotional response is due to the physiological response. So again, let's apply this to the example of your dog. So you see your dog, and this causes you to release endorphins or experience some sort of physiological response. And so then after you have this physiological response, you identify the reason for the physiological response. You say, okay, my dog's happy to see me after this shitty day that I've had. And then that is what brings about this emotion of happiness. And again, the difference between Schachter-Singer and James-Lange is that the physiological response is not causing the emotion for the Schachter-Singer. Instead, you must identify the reason for this physiological response before you experience the emotion. The last theory of emotion is called the Lazarus Theory. And the Lazarus Theory says that the experience of emotion depends on how the situation is appraised or labeled. So going back to the situation of the dog, you see your dog, and the first thing you do is you appraise this situation. You say, oh, my dog's happy to see me. Look at that, my dog wagging its tail, its tongue's out. It's a freaking cute dog, maybe it's a golden retriever, which is the cutest dog, by the way. And so you appraise the situation. And then what happens next is you have a physiological response, which is the release of endorphins, and you experience emotion, and those occur at the same time. So I think the main thing to remember about the Lazarus theory is that you must first appraise the situation. And anytime you see on the MCAT appraisal in the context of emotion, you should automatically think Lazarus. All right, before I move on to the next part, I want to teach you a little mnemonic or a little saying in order to keep all three of these theories straight. So when you think of James-Lange, think of James Bond and how he's always involved in action. And so this makes me think then that in the James-Lange theory, our body must first act, i.e. have a physiological response before we can experience the emotion. So James-Lange, James Bond, action. And then for the cannon barred theory, imagine a bad cannon, right? And so when this bad cannon shoots, it actually hits two separate points, kind of like makes a V as it shoots out, hits a high point, hits a low point. And you could essentially imagine that these two targets are the two different factors that the cannon barred theory says are happening simultaneously, right? Which says that you have an emotional response and physiological response simultaneously. So cannon barred, bad cannon, two simultaneous targets. For the Schachter-Singer theory, I think two S's, which reminds me of two factors. And so in this theory, there's two factors, right? You must have a physiological response or physiological arousal, and then you also must have some understanding of the surrounding around you. You must have some cognition about the surroundings in order to then have an emotional response. So Schachter-Singer, two S's, two-factor theory. And in full disclosure, I took some of those kind of sayings from people on Reddit. I just really like that, and I actually did use this on the test when I studied, so keep that in mind. All right, so those are the 4 theories of emotion to know. Let's get on now to the last segment in this podcast, where I'm going to talk about motivational theories. Psychologists have long asked, what motivates behavior? And they've come up with quite a few different theories to help answer this question. And I'm going to go through these theories, 5 of them to be exact, and these are the 5 that you are kind of most likely to see on the MCAT, in my opinion. And so that is going to be the drive reduction theory, incentive theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, expectancy theory, and opponent process theory. All right, so the first one I'll go through here is called the drive reduction theory of motivation. And it was established by Clark Hull, who was a behaviorist And essentially what the drive reduction theory says is that you behave in order to reduce drives. And what are drives? Well, drives are a state of tension or arousal caused by a biological or physiological stimulus or need. And what this does is it takes us from this state of tension and brings us to a state of balance or a state of homeostasis. So in other words, this theory just says that we act in order to fulfill our biological needs. And so a good example of this is what happens when you're outside and it's cold. Well, when you're outside and it's cold, you probably are motivated to go inside. And the drive reduction theory would say that you are driven to go inside because of a state of coldness, or say your body temperature is decreasing, and then you have this biological or physiological need to get warm, and so this is what drives you to go inside. The next theory of motivation is the incentive theory of motivation, and this was proposed by B.F. Skinner, who, if you remember this name, he also came up with the operant conditioning, right? He had these Skinner boxes that he had mice in, and he did that whole experiment. I have a podcast on that, so if you go to Learning and Memory, I talk about it there. But anyways, this B.F. Skinner guy came up with incentive theory, and he says that we are motivated by rewards that were given after we complete certain actions. And so you can think about this, what motivates you to go to the gym? Well, Skinner would say, through his incentive theory, that you go to the gym because you get rewards after. And what are the rewards? Well, the rewards are being healthy and obviously looking like a damn snack. All right, the next one I want to talk about here is called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this was developed by Abraham Maslow, as you could guess, and it claims that we are motivated by certain needs, kind of like the drive reduction theory. In this case, though, it says that some of these needs are hierarchical, meaning that some of these needs are more important than others and must be fulfilled before we can move on and fulfill our higher order needs. So if you can Google this, go look at a pyramid, but essentially there is 5 layers of needs, right? You start out with the base layer, that is the physiological needs. So that's like, hunger, the need for sex, the need for water. Those are the biological needs. Then we have safety needs. So, this is things like making sure you have a roof over your head, making sure that you're out of a dangerous situation, etc. And then you move on to the next need, which is love and belonging. And so, I think humans need love, need to feel like they belong to some sort of group. So you need to fulfill that need next. The next need on the hierarchy pyramid is the need for esteem, or the need for respect and recognition from others. And then lastly, if all 4 of these needs are met, then we work towards meeting the need of self-actualization. And this is achieving your best self, essentially. And so these are things like learning or, art, whatever we feel is going to make us our best self. So, an example of this is the fact that I am very bad at learning when I'm hungry. I don't know if this happens to the rest of you, but as soon as I get hungry, my brain tends to kind of shut down, and I'm not nearly as good at paying attention, etc. And so what this gets at is that if our physiological needs are not met, which, again, this is the base of the pyramid, this is the number 1 most important need in Maslow's hierarchy. If these are not met, then we can't meet the other needs. And let's just say that learning is part of my self-actualization, and therefore that's not going to be met if I can't meet my physiological needs. So, that's kind of an example there. The next theory of motivation is called the expectancy theory, and this is also called the expectancy value theory. And this was developed by a fellow named Victor Vroom, which is, number 1, a great name. Number 2, if this dude did not do some kind of car racing, He obviously didn't do his life right. Love that name. Anyways, the expectancy value theory states that the amount of motivation needed to reach a goal depends on two things. Number one, the individual's expectation of success, and number two, the degree to which they value that goal. In other words, motivation comes from how much success that we think we're going to have towards that activity or towards that goal, and the value which we place on that activity and goal. All right, and getting on to the last theory of motivation here, we have the opponent process theory. And this is kind of the most convoluted, hard to understand, so I'm going to try to do a good job explaining. But essentially, it states that when one emotion is experienced, the other emotion is suppressed. So let's say you feel happy. Well, that means the sad feeling is repressed. So that's kind of that's the underlying theoretical principle that this sits on. And so this theory says that every experience we have is followed by a secondary opponent process. So let's talk about this in terms of skydiving. And this is actually where this theory came from, was when it was observed in skydivers. So the first time a skydiver jumps, they have a ton of fear. And when they land, they have a ton of relief, right? And so they have this primary process, which is fear, and then they have this secondary process, which is a feeling of relief or happiness when they land. And what scientists found was that as this skydiver kept jumping more times, what happened was the primary process became weaker, so that fear started to go down. But what happened is that secondary process actually strengthened. So even after subsequent jumps, that happy feeling when they landed, or that relief when they landed, that feeling actually increased or strengthened. And so this is most important for understanding the motivation regarding drug addiction. So what it says is essentially that people, when they take drugs, right, they feel a lot of pleasure at first, and then that's the primary process, and then they feel withdrawal later, and that's the opponent process. And so what happens over time, right, is when they've been taking these drugs, the pleasure starts to decrease, but the withdrawal effects start to increase. And this causes them to take even more drugs, right? You take more and more drugs to actually offset this withdrawal. And eventually, this person doesn't even take the drug anymore for pleasure, right? Instead, they're actually motivated to avoid withdrawal. And so this goes to kind of point out why drug addicts are addicted, or why drug addicts are motivated to continue taking these drugs. And so what the opponent process theory gets at is essentially that we are motivated by the secondary processes that increase as we continue to do things over and over and over. So for skydiving, that is the positive effect of having that happiness or that relief when you land. Or for drugs, it's that withdrawal that actually motivates you to continue to do these drugs. All right, so that concludes the motivational theory talk. It also concludes the podcast on sociological theories. I hope this helped. A lot of information. You know, what I did here is I made a lot of flashcards, specifically Anki flashcards, with all these different theories, as well as examples of the theories, as well as these theories applied to medicine, because I think that's really the biggest thing to understand, is how can I point the lens of these theories towards medicine. So kind of keep that in mind as you're going over practice problems or practicing or putting these on note cards, is you really want to be able to apply them to medicine, which goes beyond being able to just recall the definition. So make sure you practice. I hope this podcast helped. As always, please leave us a review if you really liked it. It helps with the iTunes rankings, which helps more people get access to it, which helps, people study and stuff. So if you like it, rate us, review us. I really appreciate it. As always, thanks for listening. Be looking out for a bonus episode this week. And see you next time.
Hey, what are you doing? Hey.
Sam's MCAT Basics is written, produced, and recorded by Murph the dog. Special thanks to Murph the dog for this episode.